turn our attention further south and South Africa's public service employment numbers. It's growing 4 times faster than overall employment in other sectors. It's all according to a survey to be published by the South African Institute of Race Relations. This has raised some fears that the government is not really filling the positions that are required to improve on service delivery and effectively bolstering and boosting the wage bill, which doesn't really bode well for fiscal restraint. Now, Lucy Holborn, she joins us now. She's a research manager at the South African Institute of Race Relations. So right there, you already know what I'm going to be asking you. Let's talk about this growth in public sector employment over the last 10 years, set to be somewhere in the region of 22%. So why do we have capacity problems in government?
Well, I think it's a question of where those jobs are being created. We know of the 1.3 million public service workers, about 450,000 are public sector nurses and teachers, another 200,000 are in the police service. But there's all those other bureaucrats behind the scenes, some of which are clearly essential, but some of which are a sort of another layer of bureaucracy that some people question whether people are getting value for money in that sense. So the increase in numbers doesn't necessarily directly correlate to improved service delivery.
Okay. Is it worrying that the state has become a major employer? Some would say that's a worrying trend.
I think so. If we look at trends in Europe, they're trying to scale back their public sector, and that creates huge problems in retrenching people, reducing the wage bill of the public service. We already know that public sector personnel expenditure accounts for a third of all government expenditure. So it's quite a high figure already. And Pravin Gordhan has said he wants to keep it at 5% growth over the next few years. But at the moment, in the last few years, it's been growing at 17%. So we need to look at those sorts of issues and look at whether this is really sustainable in terms of our fiscal policy.
So when the wage bill is growing at 17% because government is paying salaries, it raises the question of productive uses of taxpayers' money versus this recurrent expenditure. Government has committed itself to an infrastructure program, but we're told that there's huge bottlenecks in the tendering process, which is good. Better governance, make the process more democratic. But we're not seeing better use of the buck as taxpayers. What could the government do better?
Well, I think clearly it's about efficiency of the use of those funds. So part of that will be the skills of the people working in government at all levels of management. We just saw yesterday the Auditor General report looking at accounting skills. Those sort of financial management skills are really important to make sure taxpayers get value for money in terms of these frontline services. We know, for instance, in the government housing sector, huge amounts of money are being wasted either through fraud or just poor management. So it's those sorts of issues that can ensure that money is spent well and that the people we are employing in public sector are earning their wage, as it were.
Yeah. We've got a new growth path, and their government is hoping that overall the South African economy can absorb 5 million people into the economy. If the private sector is loath to employ because they're worried about their margins, it then leaves it to the government to create those labor-intensive areas that can absorb people into jobs. So public works programs, infrastructure build programs. So in the context of the government's priorities for job creation, are we going to see a lot more public service jobs then?
Well, it's been talked about in various departments. We hear the Department of Agriculture talking about rural employment schemes. We hear about infrastructure schemes, expanded public works programs, those sorts of things. So we can expect it to some extent, but I think we have to be very careful at assuming that the government can solve this problem themselves. 5 million jobs is 5 times as many public service employees as we already have. So clearly government can't be responsible for all of those jobs. And we have to look at how the government can play a role in allowing the private sector to create the jobs. That will be sort of labour market regulation, those sorts of issues, small business, encouraging small businesses. They'll be major employers in the future. And we've got to look at those sorts of things and look at the government's role as more an enabler for creating jobs rather than the body that creates jobs itself.
I'm glad you mentioned labour regulation, because obviously South Africa's got this reputation, this notoriety even, of being a very tough country to hire and fire because the laws are just not flexible, and that the only way you can absorb more people into the mainstream is to have more flexible employment systems where you create seasonal jobs, casual labour, you can hire young people. How do these laws impact on government's employment policy? Because one can simplify it and say, well, then it means once people are in the system, they're in. And even if they're not performing, it would be just so difficult to get rid of the deadwood.
Well, I think these issues are experienced probably both in the private and the public sector, of people being able to keep their jobs even if they're not performing productively. And it's a major complaint among businesses, particularly small businesses who have very slim profit margins, that they can't get rid of unproductive staff and they can't scale back at times when the economy is not doing so well, and that puts them off hiring when there is better economic growth. So we clearly have to look at all of these things, and there have been some debates going on, but they're often stifled by organised labour who are not prepared to negotiate and listen to the arguments in favour of relaxing labour regulation in some areas. We're not talking about reintroducing sweatshops, we're just talking about making it easier for businesses, and particularly small businesses, young entrepreneurs, those sorts of people, to expand and hire more people if they'd like to.
You might not have these figures offhand, I don't know, but wages in the public sector compared to the private sector, often we're told that we can't retain or attract skills to public service because you're just not paying people attractive salaries that they'd be getting in the private sector. And yet when you read about what some of these technocrats are getting, it's in the millions of rands.
Well, it's an interesting question. We actually looked into it last year and found that public sector wages are on average higher than private sector wages, and interestingly they've been rising at a much faster rate. So I think they're now 45% higher than the private sector, yet 10 years ago they were about 15% higher, those sorts of figures. So we're seeing average wages in those sectors increase, and some people would argue for frontline workers like nurses and teachers, they aren't paid enough and they ought to be paid more because they're doing a very important service. But as you say, it's those technocrats at top level that are sometimes receiving, we hear of some of these civil servants earning more than the president himself, or those sorts of issues. And we do have to look at that as a serious issue, and to make sure that can be a way that we can restrain the public sector wage bill.